Hello, welcome, and thank you for tuning in to Channel ATV. Our vision is to give people a voice through dedicated digital media broadcasting. For more latest and exclusive footage, please follow us on social media at Channel ATV or visit us on our website at www.channelatv.org. And now, stay tuned for our feature presentation.
Nonprofit organization in the education, health, and human services sectors? Do you need grant funding for your organization? Or do you need help developing programs to help you raise money for your nonprofit organization? At Vibrant Funding, our mission is to connect our nonprofit partners in the education, health, and human services sectors to the financial resources required to achieve their mission. We support nonprofit organizations based in and operating in the United States and Africa. We offer the following services to new and established organizations: program development, donor engagement and retention, grants research and writing. Contact us at www.vibrant-funding.com or email us at info@vibrant-funding.com. Call us at 404-751-6802 to learn more about our services and how we can help you to have an impact on the world. Vibrant Funding, connecting donors and nonprofits.
My name is Siangonya, and I'll be your facilitator for today. I am a professional grants writer and project manager with 14 years of experience in this area. I've provided grants and proposal writing and management services to organizations in both the United States and Africa, and helped them secure millions of dollars in annual funding to advance their missions. I am passionate about supporting entrepreneurs and nonprofit leaders on the African continent with securing the financial resources they need to thrive. Before we get started, we would like to acknowledge the following organizations and individuals: our host, the Embassy of the Republic of Zambia in Washington, D.C., our sponsor, Vibrant Funding, our executive producer, Mr. Davis Chiwa with Channel ATV, and special thanks to His Excellency, Ambassador Chibamba Kanyama, and Mr. Charles Tembo, Press Secretary at the Embassy of the Republic of Zambia in Washington, D.C. We have received several inquiries from individuals seeking support with their nonprofit organizations. This is our fee structure effective today until the offer expiration conditions are met. This offer is only valid for African-based nonprofit organizations. Please send an email to the email account on the screen if you're interested in these consulting services. Thank you. Let's get started now.
Session 1. Introduction to Budgets. The learning objective of this session is to outline the standard components of a project budget. Did you know that many funders look at the executive summary and budget first before even looking at your project description? Think about why that is. A budget is a roadmap for your project. It not only outlines where you're going, but it also tells a story in numbers of how you plan to get there, with a picture of all the resources involved in the process. Creating a budget will provide a clear and realistic projection of how much money you have, how much money you need to spend, and how much you need to bring in to meet your goal and complete your project effectively. In short, the budget is a key piece of your proposal, a document that, if done well, will illustrate your project with the perfect and clarity as a mirror image to your narrative. You know you've succeeded if you give your budget to someone unfamiliar with your work, and they can still figure out what you're trying to do without having read a word of your proposal's narrative. Typically, you're not alone in creating a budget. The best person to start drafting the budget is often the person who knows the project best. It usually ends up being a team including the fundraising, finance, and program staff. The finance and accountant provide the numbers for personnel expenses. The project manager is the person who really understands the project timeline. And then, of course, the grants writer or proposal writer, which is you. As a proposal writer, you should have access to the details regarding the project's purpose and its expenses. You also have information about its expected outcomes. You also see the broader picture of the current and future grants and income in play, as well as the timeline of project milestones. Overall, you provide the context of the budget. Now, we do realize that in many cases, the proposal writer is also the program manager or the executive director. If this is your situation, remember that proposal writing is a skill that is fully within your reach for you to learn. And the same goes for budgeting. Many people who are new to creating budgets can feel intimidated while contemplating a sea of numbers and mathematical equations. Don't worry, any math you need to do in this webinar will be pretty simple: addition, subtraction, and multiplication. We'll walk you through each element of the budget piece by piece. Plus, any numbers can become less daunting when tied to the concrete reality of your project's inner workings. Now that you know who will help you with the process of developing the budget, next, let's see what goes into the budget. A budget really has two parts. It includes your expected expenses, which are the true cost of your project, and your income, which is the expected funds needed to meet these costs. These two parts of the budget, expenses and income, will be the focus of the next few lessons in this webinar. Here's a knowledge check. The budget is like a mirror, reflection of the proposal narrative. It is crystal clear with everything you mention in the narrative having a place in the budget and vice versa. Let's review what we learned in this session. We learned that a budget is a roadmap for your project. It not only outlines where you're going, but it also tells the story numbers of how you plan to get there, with a picture of all the resources involved. Just like the proposal narrative, you can't work on the budget alone. We also discussed that what goes into a proposal budget: your expected expenses, which are the true costs of your project, and your income, the expected funds needed to meet those costs. Session 2. Developing your budget, personnel expenses. The learning objectives of this session are to determine the full cost of a project and allocate the correct staff time in a project budget. Did you know that personnel costs are the largest single expense in a typical budget? In many project budgets, the largest single expense is often your personnel costs, so you spend much of your time within the budgeting process crafting this piece. The personnel section is where you enter information about all staff working on the project, including salaries and wages and fringe benefits. To begin, you list all of the employees who will spend time on the project. Who might these include? These are the program directors, program managers, or program assistants, the executive director, and staff from other departments. For many nonprofit organizations, their staff often wear multiple hats, meaning they are involved in multiple roles. So typically you're pulling someone in from another department to work on a new project, or from another project to work on your new project. And of course, you could also be creating a new position just for this project, in which case you need to think about what new roles will be added and what those new staffers' salaries will be. Either way, you need to know who's going to be doing the work. If you're not sure, talk to the project manager or look at the staffing section in the related proposal narrative. In the next slides, we'll explore this part of the budgeting process in action with an example. Let's take a few seconds to read this particular case study. The Second Gift project enlists the services of retired teachers as senior reading tutors, providing crucial one-on-one instruction for struggling students in Kalush district. By assisting Kalush students who are struggling at the primary school level, at this critical time in their schooling, the Second Gift project seeks to improve education across the entire district and maximize the assistance to those students in need. A team of 40 paid tutors will provide instruction to students on a part-time basis. Prior to beginning work with the students, our tutors will be recruited by the Kalushi Community Center's senior coordinator and trained by a professional reading instructor who work in a consulting capacity to be a resource for the tutors and students over the course of the program. Based on the case study above, who needs to be in your personnel section? Based on the case study we just discussed, we have two roles that will be included. We have the senior coordinator at full-time and then 40 part-time senior tutors. What about the instruction consultant? For the consultant, we'll get back to that role and we'll discuss it in detail in terms of where you can place them. The second gift project is overseen by the Children's Center Director, who provides supervision to the senior coordinator and steers the project's goals, but she'll limit her involvement to 20% of her time, as she oversees several other programs within the Children's Center as well. This means we have one more person to add to our personnel list, bringing us to a total of 42 people. Next, we'll figure out how to allocate staff time. Be sure to manage your time allocations on your proposal budget very carefully. Many of us have staff that work on more than one project or budget. When putting together your budget for a proposal, it's important to make sure that the time reflected for that staff person is going to accurately reflect the work that they're going to do should you get these funds. So for example, let's say that you have a staff member who is going to spend half of their time working on the project that you're applying for, and then half of their time on an existing project. It's important to note that on the project budget, because funders will need to know that you're investing their money wisely. A few tips on setting staff salaries. Setting salaries are a sensitive subject in the nonprofit sector, whether in Zambia or other countries for that matter, especially since our goals are to maximize the funds that are donated to us. A lot of organizations tend to set their salaries based on the overall organization budget, with past salaries being the baseline or starting point. But doing a little research outside can impress your funders because you can demonstrate that you're intentional in meeting the needs of your clients and those that support them or your staff. Unlike in the US or in Europe, it is sometimes difficult to get publicly accessible information on how much staff members in the nonprofit sector are being paid. As such, we recommend that you engage an accounting firm if your resources allow you to capture that data from other nonprofit organizations in your sector. Before we finish up the personnel section with benefits, let's look at an example of how salaries are listed in a budget. Here we'll pick up from our example budget with the second gift project. The project has 2 salaried employees and 40 hourly employees. The Children's Center Director spends 20% of her time at a salary of $64,000, and the senior coordinator spends 25% of his time on the budget at $45,000. So when we multiply their percent allocations on their salaries, we find that the Center Director will require $12,800, and the senior coordinator will require $11,250. And then for the senior tutors who are hourly, there are 40 of them working 3 hours per week, and they'll spend 20 weeks on the program at $14 an hour, dedicated 100% of their time, which means we'll need $33,600 for these individuals. And here's how these calculated wages would appear in the second gift proposal budget. Keep in mind that you need to make your information on your budget very clear and very simple and easy for anyone to scan and to read. So based on the calculations we had earlier, the total salaries and wages is $57,650. It's your turn now at this stage to also practice. Now that we've made some headway into seeing what the budget should look like, it's time to start thinking about your own project budget. Use a template that was emailed out to you earlier to start filling out your own personnel section. You'll find it in worksheet number 3 of the spreadsheet. In addition to salaries, you should also include the cost of benefits. Examples of benefits include private health insurance, dental insurance, retirement and pension, or life insurance. If your organization has financial staff, your accountant or finance person will know what your fringe rate is for the benefits, and you can add that amount to your budget. If you're wondering how hourly and part-time employees factor into your calculations, you have to keep in mind that certain basic benefits are required by law for part-timers as well, and these contributions will make their way into your overall fringe benefit rate. It looks like some participants are not sure on this, We'll actually tackle this in the next section. In the next slide, we'll examine how you can calculate your benefits rate. To clarify this point, keep in mind that it is helpful to understand where all the numbers come from. In our example, the second gift project, the team has listed 22% of salary to be counted towards their benefits, which brings it to a total of $12,683 out of their subtotal $57,650. So their calculation is based on the entire salaries for the entire organization. So in this case, we see that fringe benefit range for health insurance is $90,000, dental insurance is $46,000, retirement and pension at $40,000, for benefits total of $176,000 out of an $800,000 payroll. So in this instance, when we divide the two elements, $176,000 divided by $800,000, we get the 22% that they're using to calculate their fringe benefits. Here's what the personnel section of the budget looks like in its full form with benefits factored in. So we have salaries and wages at $57,659 and benefits at $12,683, and the total personnel now becomes $70,333. So that wraps up our personnel section. We have captured all the people involved on the project at this stage. Another question from a participant: what if you have consultants or contractors? Where do they go? Okay, for that one, we'll talk about that in session 3. And with that, you have reached the end of session 2. Let's preview what we learned today in this session. We hope that your confidence is growing as you now know staff members who are likely to play a role in drafting a proposal budget, the two types of a budget, the budget's relationship to the overarching grant proposal. As we jump into session 3, we'll tackle expenses first, starting with direct expenses and personnel. Developing your budget, non-personnel expenses. The learning objectives of this session is to determine the full cost of a project. Now that your personnel section is done, we will do the same for non-personnel expenses, otherwise known as everything. This is where you think of every possible expense you might have as an estimated dollar value. Include as many of the potential costs as you can think of. In addition, a common mistake made by those who are new to budgeting is to forget something. This is why you want to partner with a project manager to get the most accurate information of all the moving parts of the project. Keep in mind that all direct expenses in your budget are either personnel or non-personnel. Your objective here is to include all costs directly associated with a project. One way to think about the direct costs is to ask yourself if you would still incur a particular expense if your project didn't exist. The actual line items in each budget will vary depending on the activities, but typically include the following items laid out in this table. For example, insurance, printing, office space rental, or internet expenses. Did you notice that professional fees and consultants appear in the list above? Yes, this is where you include consultants. Consultants don't work for your organization and they don't receive benefits, so they won't be included in the personnel section. Sometimes budgeters are unsure about where to put their marketing costs. There isn't always one answer to this question, but there are several questions that you can ask yourself to decide where to put your marketing expenses. Are you dealing with marketing costs that are solely dedicated to this project? If so, you would include these under non-personnel. Did you hire an external consultant specifically for marketing dedicated to this project? In this case, they would fall under professional fees and consultants within direct costs. Do you only have general marketing costs for the organization as a whole and not specific to this program? In this case, your costs for marketing can fall under indirect or overhead costs. We hope that this helps. What happens if some of your supplies or other non-personnel costs haven't been purchased yet? For example, what should you do if you're budgeting for a brand new program? The answer to this question is to get estimates. Here are some tips along those lines. 1. Research 3 estimates, either through the internet or by contacting companies directly for a quotation. For example, if you want to purchase a 4x4 vehicle to visit your program participants in rural areas, you would get quotations from a car dealership. Collect and document each quote so that you have a record of your cost estimates. Always save copies of these quotes in case the funder follows up with additional questions during the review process. Choose the estimate that is most reasonable and appropriate for your project. In the end, it shouldn't really be about the price. There are many factors you can take into consideration, including quality. But overall, your estimated cost should be reasonable, complete, and realistic. What happens if a funder won't pay for certain expenses? Some funders will not allow certain costs in your project, such as food, equipment, or travel. You often find these types of limitations written in the foundation's grant guidelines, or on their website or in their application form. In that case, you have to leave these costs in the budget but somehow indicate that the item not allowed by the particular funder will still be covered by another way or another funding source. Overall, it is in your best interest to always seek out funding from funders with the fewest restrictions on allowed expenses. However, you need to be prepared to tweak or change your budget depending on the requirements of your funder. Let's look at an example budget from our case on the next slide on handling funders' restrictions. Let's say the second gift project is approaching Foundation X, which states that it doesn't fund salaries. If the project leaders are comfortable with that restriction and confident that they can secure the salary funding from other sources, then we will subtract any staff salaries from the request, leaving just the personnel costs remaining for this particular ask. If you have questions about the line marked overhead, we'll explain it in a moment, but first, let's wrap up direct expenses. Let's take a closer look at our complete non-personnel section for the second gift project. Non-personnel, we have a consultant for reading, we have the consultant/reading specialist who work for 30 days at $250 per day. We have food and snacks, we have promotion and correspondence materials, we have supplies and books donated by the Copperbelt Publishing Company, transportation for students and senior tutors at $3,200. When we combine all our direct expenses, we come up with $16,050. Again, we've shared the budget template via email that you can work to complete on your own. For the fringe benefits, please work in section number 4 within the spreadsheet and then add all in your non-personnel expenses under worksheet number 5. After you've developed your budget to include your project's personnel and non-personnel costs, the next step is to add the indirect cost. Your personnel and non-personnel costs are tied to the project, are considered your direct expenses or costs. But to provide a complete picture, we also need to include indirect costs. While direct costs are what we see on the surface, indirect costs are also known as hidden costs because they cover what goes on behind the scenes. A way of thinking about indirect expenses is the cost of doing business. Other ways in which these costs are sometimes labeled on budget includes overhead costs, administrative costs, and supporting services. Let's put indirect expenses in perspective using an example of purchasing a vehicle. Let's say you are approved by your bank for a loan to purchase a 4x4 vehicle for $10,000 and you found a 4x4 that you loved for that price at exactly $10,000. Technically, you should be able to afford it, but if you figure in that you would need to pay for insurance, registration, and maybe some other fees, the true cost of ownership for that vehicle will be much higher. This brings us to our conclusion for session number 3. What we learned in this session is that non-personnel expenses, otherwise known as everything else, is where you list everything that you can possibly need for your project. Your personnel and non-personnel costs are tied to the project and known as direct costs. Session 4, creating your budget income. The learning objective of this session is to develop the income side of a project budget. Are you ready to tackle the other half of your budget? You're making great progress at this stage. Let's talk about income. Income for your project comes in from two sources, support and revenue. Support can include both cash, gifts, and in-kind contributions. The following are typical sources of cash gifts and grants that you're likely to encounter as a nonprofit leader in Africa. These include foundations, corporations, individuals, such as your board of directors, special events, and even the government. Earned income is what we mean by revenue. This includes fees for services or the sale of goods. This could be tickets to an event, the sale of publications or products, or fees for direct services such as student registration fees or tuition, museum entrance fees, or tours that you charge. In other words, this is revenue generating activity, much like a business. Let's learn from the United States nonprofit sector. The United States has one of the most developed nonprofit sectors in the world. When we think about how nonprofits sustain themselves, we often think first of donations and grants. But did you know in reality that most nonprofit organizations in the United States receive less than 25% of their revenue from donations and grants? The majority of their nonprofit funding actually comes from program services. So, based on the data provided by the Internal Revenue Service of the United States government, we see that 70% of nonprofit income comes from program services. As nonprofit leaders in Zambia, we also need to start learning how to incorporate fees for services into our program financing. We have to think about introducing fees for our services and move away from overly providing free services to the people that we serve. Let's take another look at our example and focus on the income section. Note that not all of these types of income may apply to you, so when you create your own budget, just list those that are relevant to your specific project or organization. Under grants and contributions, you want to include any contributions you receive from government sources or corporations or foundations and individuals. If you receive support from individual donors, you don't need to list each individual, just the total amount received. You only want to list the details for confirmed grants, not pending requests. In the second gift example, the corporate donations are all committed, but one of the foundation donors is pending. Earned income includes fees for services or the sale of goods, as we mentioned earlier. Some nonprofits charge membership fees or dues. If this is applicable to your organization, you want to include those in your income as well, if you're using some of this revenue to underwrite any of the project expenses. And then we have in-kind support, which we'll now talk about next. Please take time after the webinar to refer to the budget template we shared and start filling out the income section for your own budget. Keep in mind that any grants, corporate support, government funding, and individual contributions can be added under support in the worksheet number 1 within the spreadsheet. If you receive revenue through the sale of goods, services, membership fees, or ticket sales, you can enter it under earned income under worksheet number 2 of the spreadsheet. In-kind support, these are gifts that are not monetary in nature. Often when we talk about in-kind contributions, we think about goods, products, or equipment, but in-kind contributions can also be pro bono services, volunteers, or space. For example, for space, a local organization can give you a room to carry out your activities without charging you. Products can include computers or software that are donated by a company, including office equipment. And of course, time from your volunteers can be in kind. Services can include things such as a local law firm providing free legal services or a graphic designer providing promotional materials. The tricky part with in-kind contributions is understanding how to present them in your budget. If you receive in-kind support in the form of donated space for your program, it should be shown as both an income and as both as an expense and as income. Let's take a look at this example. So we have in-kind support in the form of $5,000 as rental space, and our rent expense is $5,000. Keep in mind how these two items have cancelled themselves out. Although including in-kind contributions in your budget helps to show funders that you have the support of others, be aware that some funders do not allow them in proposal budgets. In other cases, funders ask applicants to note any in-kind contributions in a footnote. Let's look at our example. We see that the Copperbelt Publishing Company provided reading materials valued at $3,500. The in-kind support can be listed as in-kind support subtotal $3,500. Separating in-kind donations shows the funder how much cash you need to raise and that you're not requesting for less than what you need. Section 4 Conclusion. Revenue is based on earned income from selling goods or services like a business. Contributions meanwhile consist of donations, grants, foundation funding, corporate funding, etc. In-kind donations show up under income and expenses because the goods or services are an element of the program and therefore an expenses of the program. But because you have received them, they are also a form of income. The amounts will balance each other out within the budget. By the end of Lesson 4, Session 4, you should now have a full draft of your budget, containing both income and expenses. In our next and final lesson or session, we will gather some tips and tricks for better budgeting, including guidance directly from a funder. Session 5, Completing your budget. Now that you've drafted both the expenses and income parts of your budget, you have a complete draft project budget. Congratulations, you're close to the finish line. What else will the funder want? We will look at some other documents that grants funders commonly ask for next. Now, what else do nonprofit funders need from their nonprofit partners? Often, most nonprofit funders will ask for your most recent audited financial statements, organization-wide operating budgets for the most recent years, a list of supporters and other funding sources, annual reports, and a budget narrative. A budget tip that we have is to include everything the funder is asking for. Remember to include everything they're asking for and very little of anything else. Don't leave anything out just because you don't have it. Please reach out to the funders and ask them if you can send in a substitute item. For example, if you don't have an external financial audit, which can be very expensive, some funders will accept financial reviews instead, which are often less costly. The budget narratives. When line items in your budget need extra clarification, you should include a budget narrative. In essence, the budget narrative is a brief description of expenses that may accompany a budget. The budget narrative can be used to clarify specific line items, explain how the costs were estimated or determined, and justify the need for a specific expense. At this point, you have learned all the components that are likely to find their way into your budget, which means we're almost done with the webinar. But first, let's identify some helpful tips and red flags to be aware of as you embark on the budgeting process. 1. You want to avoid having a heavy dependence on one single source of funding. This sends the message to your funders that you are vulnerable. Also, if you have a planned deficit in your budget, be sure to explain that deficit and how you're going to cover it. Personnel roles should also be classified very carefully. Don't identify or classify independent contractors as contractors when their roles could be completed by a salaried employee. Also, a project budget that does not show any indirect expenses is a red flag. Also, if your budget contains items that don't seem related to the work, the funders become suspicious. For example, a common item that we see often in large budgets proposals from Zambia are requests for expensive vehicles such as 4x4s, which you don't always have to buy a vehicle for your project. Remember to focus on the needs of the population that you serve. Congratulations, you're now done with the webinar. Let's quickly review what we learned. 1. Make sure you're including everything you will need in your proposal budget. The budget narrative helps you to clarify in words any line items of your budget that might not be self-explanatory. Also, keep in mind that your funders do pay close attention to what you put in your budget. Be realistic and reasonable in your requests. How do you stay in touch with us after this webinar? One, the best way to keep in touch with us is via email at training@vibrantfunding.com. Given the many questions we received from participants, we'll be sharing quarterly educational information to better support you in your growth as a nonprofit leader. We look forward to future engagements with you, and thank you so much for being an active participant in this webinar.